Hello students, today and in the coming lectures we will study a class of machine learning models known as neural networks. The neural network models have shown great success in almost all machine learning applications, including computer vision, natural language processing, speech data analysis. We will first study the theoretical formulations and then see some of the applications. The outline of today's lecture is as follows. First, we will see the motivation behind the neural networks. Then, we will see the definitions of the hypothesis of the neural networks. We begin with the basic properties of the neural networks and learn on how we can train them on data. We will also introduce a variety of useful techniques for fitting the data by minimizing the in-sample error. Because neural networks are a very flexible model with a great approximation power, they tend to overfit the data. We will study a number of techniques to control overfitting, specific to neural networks. What can we achieve with the linear aggregation of perceptrons? Let's take a look at this picture where we combine several perceptrons. We can create an interesting structured model. Here we have two-layered structure, and each layer has different weights. The first layer represented by W's, and then second layer's weights are represented by alphas. And for the given input data, this is our vector of d-dimensionality. D is a dimensionality of the vector. So the first layer consists of t perceptrons, like G1, ranging from G1, G2, up to GT. They are indeed simple perceptrons individually, each taking input vector. All these arrows point to each of these perceptrons, G1, G2. And each of these perceptrons have their associated weights. So W1 is the weight of the first perceptron, W2 is the weight of the second perceptron, etc. We also know that after passing through these nonlinear step function, the output of each perceptron will be denoted as alpha. Alpha 1, which is the output of the first perceptron, alpha 2, alpha up to alpha t. In turn, these alphas are fed to another perceptron, single perceptron, denoted by G, capital G. Okay, and we can see this G can be represented as follows, as shown in the following formula. So the first layer is a linear combination of several perceptrons passing through sine function, right? WTX. And then second sine function is represented as here, sine of on top of the linear combined individual perceptrons output. Two layer of weights, WT, and then alpha. And two layers of sine functions. First sine function, another second sine function in capital G. Actually, the neural networks are a generalization of perceptrons, which uses nonlinear transform, nonlinear feature transform, through a spatially designed transforming or activation functions. They are indeed considered to be very powerful and flexible. We will see that the feature transforms will be represented by an intermediate small g functions. Okay, and having these complex structure, our next goal is to study what kind of boundary the following structure can implement. Nonlinear or linear ones? Let's see. We can use perceptrons to implement simple logic operations. For example, we can combine the following two simple perceptrons to implement logic and operations. Graphically, the blue region, if we combine G1 and then G2, will correspond to true, only if the output of G1 and then G2 will be +1, as shown here. Otherwise, all will be red. Graphically, the aggregation of two perceptrons, G1 and then G2, will take the following layered structures. So we have input, first layer, that consists of two perceptrons, G1 and G2. And in the second layer, we have another single perceptron, denoted by G, big G, that takes the output of G1, G2 as input and implements the Boolean AND function, the G. Note that the weights of the second layer, denoted by alpha, 0, alpha 0, alpha 1, alpha 2, will define whether G implements Boolean AND function or OR function, or other Boolean function, for instance. Well, the following set of weights, where alpha is -1, 0, alpha 1 is +1, alpha 2 is +1, will give us the hypothesis that will implement the Boolean AND function. We'll have -1 plus G1 plus G2. You can check. If G1 and G2 outputs are same, +1, then this function will give us true. In other words, this will correspond to this blue region, right? Otherwise, if G1, G2 outputs are different, then all the outputs will be considered as a -1 in this region. That will fall in this region. Also note that we can combine different perceptrons, simple perceptrons, try to implement or not function, Boolean functions, right? I leave it as an exercise to you, trying to find out different alphas here using the same structure, right? And try to implement or and not. Why? Okay, why we care about Boolean functions and perceptrons? The Boolean function has a property of nonlinearity, especially the exclusive OR function, right? Showing that we can implement such a nonlinear function by combining different simple perceptrons is a first important step to building more complex layered neural networks. Okay, let's see some other examples. Let us use a target on the right, which is related to complex nonlinear function. In fact, we can represent this nonlinear target function as a combination of different simple perceptrons. Here we show a proof by picture illustrations for this nonlinear target function using different perceptron combinations. For instance, we can combine 8 perceptrons and implement the following decision target boundary. Each line here corresponds to one perceptron, linear perceptron. However, if we combine more perceptrons, as in this case, we have 16 perceptrons, then we can even notice more smooth target boundary. The formal proof of this situation is somewhat similar to the theorem in calculus, which says that any continuous function on a compact set can be approximated arbitrarily closely using step functions. In this case, the step function is a perceptron. However, we have so many perceptrons, we may have so many perceptrons, yielding a higher VC dimension and with higher degrees of freedom. This is a problem, but at least being aware of this means that we can overcome it by using an adequate number of examples. We know also that Boolean exclusive OR function, as I mentioned earlier, is a nonlinear function, as shown here on the right picture. But we can implement this Boolean exclusive OR function using, again, simple linear combinations of individual simple perceptrons. We can build a multi-layer perceptron to approximate an arbitrary complex target function. For instance, the exclusive OR Boolean function can be decomposed into perceptrons using OR of AND, which can be implemented by a 3-layer perceptron, as shown here. We have already seen the implementation of the AND operations. And if we add OR, as shown here, at the last layer, then exclusive OR can be implemented using the following multi-layered perceptron model. So first AND layer, second AND layer, and then OR. To deal with negation that appears in the exclusive OR function, we negate the weights and multiply with the inputs. So negation are shown here, -1. Also appears here. If we can compare the graph form of this exclusive OR that we have just constructed with the graph from the simple perceptron, we notice more layers of nodes are used between the input and then output to implement the exclusive OR function. As compared to simple perceptron, we call it as a multi-layer perceptron. The additional layers that appear here between input and then output are called hidden layers. And each circle, each output of hypothesis, this is called as a node. Also, in some literature calls it as a neuron. Okay, so these are the nodes. These are the layers. Output layer, first hidden layer, second hidden layer. This is input layer. Also note that the layers feed forward into next layer only. Given input, okay, all the inputs are feed forward. There are no backward pointing arrows. It only flows from input to the output in one direction. Okay, this leftmost layer is not usually counted as a layer. It's just called as input. Okay, so in this example, there are 3 layers. First layer, second layer, third layer. 2 hidden layers with 3 nodes, 1, 2, 3 nodes, and 1 output layer with 1 node. All right, the simple perceptron has no hidden layers. It has just an input and output. The addition of hidden layers is what allows us to implement the more complicated target. In fact, a suitably large 3-layer, multi-layer perceptron can closely approximate just about any target function and fit any dataset. So it is a very powerful learning model. We should always use it with care. If our multi-layer perceptron is too large, too complex, we may lose the generalization ability. Neural networks are a biologically inspired model. They were originally designed to simulate the learning process in biological organisms. For instance, the human nervous system has a layered structure which contains cells called neurons, as shown in this picture. The neurons are connected to one another with the use of synapses. And also, we have the strengths of synaptic connections that often change in response to external stimuli. Again, this change causes learning in living organisms, in us, in humans. Neural networks also contain computation units. We call them as nodes, or sometimes they're called as neurons. These computational nodes are connected to one another through weights, which is simulating the strength of synaptic connections in human brain, for instance. Here, each input to a neuron is scaled with a weight which affects the function computed at that unit. Also, in living organisms, synaptic weights change in response to external stimuli. In contrast, in neural networks, in artificial neural networks, the weights are learned with the use of data. They are learned from the training data, which are, again, input-output pairs. For instance, images and their labels. Biological paradigm is often criticized as a very inexact model. The functions computed in a neural network, then, are very different from those, for instance, in the brain. Okay? However, we still don't know in detail how brain works. Nevertheless, there are several examples where the principles of neuroscience have been successfully applied in designing artificial neural networks. For instance, the convolutional neural networks that we will study in the next lecture are based on architectural principles drawn from the cat's visual cortex. Just like airplanes were inspired by birds, flapping wings, the engineers were able to build a flying machine which has a very similar structure to a bird. For instance, the airplane has wings, the bird has wings, the tail, and also the tail, the head and head. However, the airplane doesn't flap their wings. Likewise, the neural network researchers aims to leverage the principles of neuroscience in neural network design. However, it is usually hard to justify any neural network architecture. In fact, much of machine learning models that we have considered so far can be considered as a shallow neural network model. By minor changes to the architecture of the perceptron, we can get either linear regression, linear classification hypothesis, or logistic regression. If you look at this neural network model, we see that the output is a linear model with the following score, classification correctness score. We have input, which is passed through the first layer and passed through the second layer, and then we apply the weight, and depending on the output, we will either get classification model, regression model. If you compare all these three linear models, as shown here, and then neural network, we can see that depending on the type of the function we use at the output here, on the score S or the signal, we can change it as either a linear classifier, linear regressor, or logistic regression hypothesis. In this case, we use sign on top of S, right? Well, in this case, in linear regression, we use identity transformation. And in logistic regression, we use sigmoid function to transform the S. Also note that all these different models use different error functions: 0-1 error, squared error, and cross entropy error. For neural network model, we will start discussing the optimization of the, let's say, squared error to obtain a neural network model for our task at hand. So depending on the type of the function we use at the output, we can obtain either classifier or regressor, or a model that outputs a probability value, right? And in neural network, we call these functions as transfer functions or activation functions. The neural network hypothesis uses a series of transformations on input data through its layers. Let's begin with a graph representation of a feed-forward neural network, the only kind we will consider in this lecture. Once we fix the size of the multi-layer perceptron, the number of hidden layers, and number of hidden units or nodes in each layer, we need to learn the weights on every link indicated by arrow using the training data we have. So far, we only talked about a sine function as a transformation of score or the signal denoted by S. The sine function is a step function. And in Perceptrons, the learning the weights was already a hard combinatorial problem when we used sine function, right? Because the optimization problem is not smooth. It is even harder with the multi-layer perceptrons if you want to use these sine function. Because it's not smooth, not differentiable, and we cannot use analytic methods to solve it. Rather, we use only combinatorial methods and find the optimal weights. So the question is, can we use other transformation functions? Well, we can try to use identity transformation. However, if you use identity, the whole network will reduce to a single perceptron, a linear hypothesis. So we can approximate the sine function or soften the sine function by using a so-called hyperbolic tangent function as defined here. This is a formula. Here we choose the hyperbolic tangent function, which can represent both linear or this step function. This is a hard threshold function. So the tangent, hyperbolic tangent, will be linear when we have our S to be 0. Okay, if the argument is 0. And nearly either plus or minus 1 for the values when S is too high, for large S. Okay, so it can capture the linear or hard threshold activation functions. Also note that we can see graphically the hyperbolic tangent function is another example of sigmoid function because its shape looks like a flattened out S related to sigmoid we used in logistic regression model. These type of networks that employ hyperbolic tangent or sigmoid functions are called sigmoidal neural networks. Just as we could use the weights learned from linear regression for classification, we can use the weights learned using sigmoidal neural network with tangent activation function for classification. We need to replace the output activation function with the sine. We can leave it as identity and have a regression model. We can change it to step function, use a sine function, and obtain a classifier or classification model based on neural network. The neural network model is our softened multi-layer perceptron now, as shown here. This graphical view is quite intuitive, with the information flowing from the inputs along the links, passing through the hidden nodes and layers, and finally reaching the output of the network. Now we need to describe these functions being computed algorithmically. So in the first step, we have to come up with a systematic notation. So let's start with the layers. We label the layers by L. Okay. In our example, we have 3 layers. First layer, second layer, third layer. The input layer is not considered a layer and is just meant for feeding the inputs to the neural network. The layer, this layer, is output layer, which determines the value of the function. The layers in between again are the hidden layers, right? So they will be denoted by small l. First layer, capital L means last layer. We will use, let's say, superscript, as shown here, to refer to a particular layer. For example, the weight of layer 1, so superscript will denote weight of layer 2, weight of layer 3, layer 1, 2, 3. And also, each layer has D dimensions, or dimensions that we denote by D. So input dimension is equal to the dimensionality of the input data. Dimensionality of the first hidden layer will be equal to the number of nodes, okay, plus the bias. Similar, another hidden layers. So we will use D to denote the dimensionality. Every layer then has one special node, which is shown here. This is a bias node, and it is not labeled. In this example, bias node is said to have an output 1 plus 1, okay, which is somehow similar to setting the x0 to 1 when we use in linear regression, linear models. Every arrow here represents a weight or connection strings from a node in a layer to a node in the next higher layer. We also note that the bias nodes have no incoming weights. They are just being fed to other units. We also have the score at each layer defined by S, L. So the score usually is defined before passing through the hyperbolic tangent. Okay, this is a weight and then input. This is the inner product between weight and input. And also, after passing through tangent, we will obtain so-called transformed input-output. So the output of the first hidden layer, for example, will be denoted by xj1. Will be, okay, defined by another s when we take the inner product with the weight on the second, so S3. Output of this layer then will be X3 after applying the transformation. At the final layer, note S will be, in this case, identity transformed, so we will not apply tangent for when the L is equal to capital L. These are the basic notations that we will follow to define the neural network hypothesis. Here, each layer of multi-layer perceptron can be interpreted as a form of nonlinear transformation that is learned from data. In other words, the nonlinear layers perform the role of hierarchical feature engineering. We will see later that the early layers will learn primitive features from the input data, while later layers will learn more complex features. When we have multi-layer perceptron of, let's say, 5 hidden layers. If you take the input as an example of an image, then early layers learn elementary edges of the pictures, middle layers contain or learn complex features like honeycombs, and later layers contain complex features like a part of a face. This will be clear in more deeper version of the multi-layer perceptrons that we will study later. Okay, so such deep multi-layer perceptron models are known as masters of feature engineering through their nonlinear transformation in hidden layers. Okay, and then final output layer is often able to perform inference with the transformed features. The neural network model is specified once we determine the architecture of the neural network. That is, the dimension of each layer and number of hidden layers. A hypothesis or neural network hypothesis is specified by selecting weights for the links shown here, these weights. In other words, finding the appropriate weights is the question of learning them from data. So our next task is to describe the necessary step that allow us to learn all these weights of the neural network that will minimize an in-sample error. If we consider one hidden layer neural network, we could simply use the aggregation of perceptron using a technique called gradient boosting, which will simply determine the optimal weight in each neuron one by one. What if we have multiple hidden layers with nonlinear transformations involved? Well, it's not going to be easy. We will discuss how we can minimize a selected in-sample error to obtain the learned weight. It will be a direct application of gradient descent algorithm that computes the gradients of the in-sample error functions efficiently. Let's consider this squared error function, which measures the difference between y and then the output of the neural network raised to the power of 2. Our next step will be computing the partial of in-sample error with respect to the weights of our neural networks. If you want to apply a gradient descent to our neural network, we will need to adjust all of the weights in the network in the direction of the negative of the gradient, given input examples. First, let's define the in-sample error function as follows. This is a squared error, and we are dealing with a supervised learning task. Y is the given label and neural network represented by n and net, which takes the input x. We can further write it down as follows. Y minus S1, this is the last layer. S is a score, right? The S represents the following. Weight of the last layer and then input to the last layer from the previous layer, L minus 1. This is our signal. So as a first step, with the initial weights, we pass a single example through neural network. And then we calculate the error on this example using the squared error. To implement gradient descent, we need to obtain the gradient of this error function, right? In sample error. This is the squared error. First, for simplicity, let us consider the gradient at the output layer, as shown here. So the partial of in-sample error with respect to the weight at the output layer. We can use chain rule for efficient computation of the gradient to separate the partial derivative. We will have two product terms after applying the chain rule, as shown here at the output layer. The partial of in-sample error with respect to S, signal, and partial of signal with respect to the weight. Because of the squared error function we are dealing with, we have the square term, and then we have the term inside. So the partial of in-sample error with respect to signal will be equal to the following. So 2 goes up, 2 minus y, and then we're left with the inner product S, right? And the partial of signal square with respect to weight is equal to the following. So we are only left with xil minus 1, xil minus 1. Look, we only need to determine the value of the first component, which we will refer to as a delta here. Let's call it as a sensitivity vector for layer L, the last layer. The second component is, as you can see, is just the input, right? Input from the previous layer to this layer, L, which is available, which can be calculated, computed. However, a signal at the last layer can be found as long as we know the type of the error function we are using, right? How about other layers? This is the gradient or partial of in-sample error with respect to the weight in the last layer. How about for the general case, for the hidden layers, for small layers? Can we calculate the first component of all layers? This component would be, again, easiest to compute if you knew the error output itself. For this reason, we will first compute it at the last layer and then propagate it backwards throughout the rest of the neural network. Now let's work through the steps needed to calculate this delta for general case for any layer. Since we said that this component is available, this is the input from L-1 layer. Our task is to calculate the sensitivity vector at each layer. To compute the partial of error with respect to any weight at a hidden layer represented by small l, we need to take a look at the sequence of steps of transformations when the data passes through the neural network during the forward propagation. For instance, let's take a look at this chain of or sequence of operations. So signal at the layer L is nonlinearly transformed by a hyperbolic tangent. Then it will define the x, the input of layer L, right, which is further multiplied by the weight of the next layer, L plus 1. Right? Then it forms the signal at L plus 1, layer L plus 1. All these three steps, the operations are applied to all other layers. Now we only need to calculate the delta, which is a partial of E with respect to signal at L. Again, we can use the chain rule to compute the following derivative of the error. So delta at L will be equal to the following three components after applying chain rule. Partial of E with respect to S L plus 1, signal at L plus 1, and partial of S at L plus 1 layer with respect to X. And then we have partial of X at this layer with respect to SL, right? These are three components. The first one, okay, if we simplify, the first one is delta at L plus 1 layer. Second one, if you do the partial of S L plus 1 with respect to X, at L we get the weight, right? We'll have the weight at L plus 1. What about this one? So partial of X at L with respect to S at L will be the derivative of the hyperbolic tangent, the activation function that we are using. Right? So main finding here is that the delta at L will depend on delta at L plus 1. This is the main finding. So partial of in-sample error with respect to signal at layer L, okay, has the following three terms. So delta L depends on the calculation of the delta at L plus 1 layer. Well, the second component here, weight at L plus 1, can be calculated. It is available during the forward propagation. And also, this component is also available, right? Since we know the activation function we're using is a hyperbolic, and we can take the derivative of this. So now, given the following relationship, what we have to do is to backpropagate the delta from the current layer to the previous layer. We know that the delta at the last layer, L, output layer, can be calculated using the definitions of the error function. Now, all that we have to do is to backpropagate the final layer's delta, which we defined as capital L, to the previous layers. This is again facilitated by using the chain rule that allows us to break the partial derivative up into multiple components, as in the following case. Formally, we call this as a backpropagation algorithm, okay, which allows us to backpropagate the delta from the last layer to the previous layers. Since we know that if we want to calculate delta at L, we need delta at L plus 1. And delta at L plus 1 depends on delta at L plus, let's say, 2. Let's see how we can summarize all these steps. If we backpropagate all the deltas from the last to the previous layers, we will be able to compute, again, the values of the deltas at every position in the network. where there is a score value, signal value. The backpropagation now algorithm can be defined or formulated as follows, with the following set of steps. First, we initialize the weights randomly and define the number of trials. Okay, this is the loop. In step 1, we select a single example randomly from the entire dataset, given n dataset. In step 2, we pass the selected example through the entire neural network. This step is called, again, as a forward propagation. Here, we can obtain all x at each layer during this forward pass. So x at all layers will become computed. In step 3, what we do is we calculate the deltas for each layer, starting from the last layer and propagating it until the first layer. Okay, forward computation, backward computation. Backward computation involves computing the delta from the last layer to the first layer. In step 4, we describe the weight update rule that applies on all layers. Weight update at layer L will be dependent on the weight of that layer minus the learning rate and input to that layer L minus 1 and delta, okay, of that layer, of that specific layer. Finally, after sufficient iterations, we obtain our neural network hypothesis called GNN net, okay, G neural network. This is defined as follows. So we have a nested structure, so hyperbolic tangent applied to, okay, weight at layer 2, transform the weight, so this is a signal of the first layer. Okay, this is repeated depending on the total number of layers. Note that the step 1, 2, and then 3 can be done in parallel and can be done many times. This allows us to calculate the average update in step 4 using not only single example, but few selected examples. Let's say pick, let's say 64 examples, and then update the weight using those 64 examples, average. We call it as a mini batch weight update. Note that the backpropagation algorithm that we discussed allows us to compute the partial derivative with respect to every weight efficiently, which can be done or to get the partial derivative of any function of the output actually with respect to weights, including, okay, the neural network with many layers. In fact, the backpropagation algorithm is used in the training of modern deep neural network models and is considered as a backbone of many complex deep neural network training. The optimization of neural network model requires the minimization of complex in-sample error function with a nested structure of nonlinear transformations, which is happening at each layer. Generally, the in-sample error of neural network is non-convex, which means that we cannot reach the global minimum using the gradient descent algorithms. This is a different situation in comparison to logistic regression and support vector machines, where we dealt with the convex functions. Choosing the initial weights and deciding when to stop the gradient descent can be tricky as compared to logistic regression, because the in-sample error is not convex anymore. Different weights can lead to different local minimum. So if the weights are initialized too large, so that the tangent hyperbolic tangent achieves the maximum or minimum of plus minus 1, then the gradient will be close to 0. And the algorithm will not get anywhere, will not update well. This is a problem if we happen to initialize the weights to the wrong sign, let's say. So it is usually best to initialize the weights to small random values where the tangent or hyperbolic tangent of our weight and input data approximates 0, so that the algorithm has the flexibility to move the weights easily to fit the data. One common choice, good choice, is to initialize the weights of your neural network using Gaussian random weights. And there are other alternative approaches when it comes to weight initialization. The multi-layer neural network is a very powerful model. And when we use the gradient descent algorithm to minimize in-sample error, we have a potential risk for overfitting. Let's discuss some practical techniques that will help us to minimize overfitting in neural networks. Well, as with linear models, we can regularize the learning using a complexity penalty by minimizing an augmented error instead of the in-sample error. Okay? So we can use the squared weight decay as a penalty term in our augmented error. This is a popular choice, which is based on the idea of shrinking the weights of the models, of the neural network models at each layer. This penalty term adds a component to the weight update as well that will move in the negative directions of the weight towards 0 weights, for instance. Hence, the term is called weight decay. If you want to obtain sparse weight solutions to effectively decrease the VC dimension of our neural network model, we can use L1 norm regularizer in our augmented error as a penalty term. However, as we know, the L1 norm is not differentiable. But still, if you want to control the VC dimension of our neural network, we can formulate a scaled version of weight decay regularizer, or L2 norm. This is also known as L2 norm regularizer, based on weight elimination. For instance, as follows. For small weight, if you look at this, for small weight, the penalty term is much like the weight decay and will decay towards 0. For large weight, the penalty term is approximately a constant. Okay, 1 plus this if it is large, and will contribute to the gradient a bit only. While small weights decay faster than large weights in weight elimination-based regularizer. Okay, and then again the effect is to eliminate those smaller weights. So large weights we apply medium shrink, small weights median shrink. In L2 norm case, if you have large weights, then this penalty term will shrink it large. For small, shrink small. But here weight decay kind of combines L2 and then L1 norm regularizer. Again, the neural networks are very powerful. They tend to overfit easily because of the complexity of the model. One method for regularization that we will discuss here is based on early stopping. For instance, an iterative method such as a gradient descent doesn't explore the entire hypothesis set at once. So with more iteration, more of your hypothesis set is explored. This means that by using fewer iterations, we explore a smaller set hypothesis, and we should get better generalization. As t increases, in-sample error tend to decrease, and VC, dimension of our neural network model, will increase. So we expect to see this kind of trade-off between approximation to the target function and generalization, which is illustrated here. This is familiar to us. We have error function versus VC dimension. And our task is to find the neural network hypothesis in the middle here with the appropriate VC dimension. We can check the neural network in action, especially the overfitting. So if we revisit the digit classification task, where we want to classify 1 versus all other digits using only 70 randomly selected data points, and we use a sigmoidal neural network with a single hidden unit and hyperbolic tangent output node, we can obtain the following results of the neural network training. The figure shows the in-sample error and then the test error versus the iteration. We can see the curve reinforces our discussion that the test error initially decreases as the approximation gain overcome the worst generalization error. Then it starts to increase. And then we can see that the overfitting problem happening here. So overfitting can be explained as the deviation between in-sample and out-of-sample error. Okay, so here, based on this observation, we can suggest that it may be better to stop early at some time point t star, well before reaching the minimum of in-sample error. Actually, this picture is observed in practice in neural network training. We can also define the time point, okay, when to stop the training neural network as a part of the validation. So be careful. Neural networks can easily overfit. In today's lecture, we have introduced the motivation behind neural networks. They are inspired by the structure and the function of our brain. We defined the neural network hypothesis having an extension of perceptron models in a multi-layered structure. Also, we discussed that the training of a complex neural network can be achieved using a backpropagation algorithm, which is based on propagating the gradient from the last layer of the neural network to the previous layers. Also, we discussed about the optimization and regularization techniques to combat the overfitting problem. So neural networks belong to state-of-the-art models in many machine learning applications. Nowadays, they dominate the machine learning field, especially the deeper version of neural network models, which will be the topic of the next coming lectures.